Ms. Gilliam graduated from Columbia University, which happens to be the same school that I graduated from. One of her co-workers when she was the first black woman reporter at the Washington Post, Luther Jackson, was also my professor at Columbia. And a lot of the things she wrote about in her book, I could just relate to. It was just very interesting, I thought. And we were just having a chat about that. I'm meeting her for the first time now. She was also the president of the National Association of Black Journalists. And I hope many of you are members. We have a student chapter here. So we are very pleased that she's going to come. So she's going to say a few words, and then we're going to begin the panel discussion. So once again, let's give her a great round of applause.
Well, good afternoon. Or is it afternoon yet? Not quite. I am so happy to be here, so happy to be in your midst this day, since we're not sure what time it is. I've always admired the work that's done by these colleges, Spelman and Morehouse, and I know that Clark Atlanta. Have I missed anybody? I know that there is definitely some mourning, and I send my condolences to all of you for the the big problem that you have faced on the campus, and we'll just continue to pray that everything works out for the good of all. So it's very exciting to be here. I'm looking forward to my two students who will be leading the questions for me, and then I hope that we have some questions and also some participation from the audience as well. So if you have questions or even comments, I hope you will feel free to ask them. But thanks again for inviting me. I want to thank my publicist and colleague for working out all the many details of my coming here. And this morning I was on Georgia Public Television. I'm here with you midday. Tonight I'll be at the Atlanta Press Club. So I'm just enjoying my day in Atlanta and look forward to interacting with you as much as possible. Thank you so much.
My name is Kayla Grant. I'm a junior mass media arts major with a concentration in journalism. I am the editor-in-chief here at Clark Atlanta University.
My name is Elmer Ellis. I'm a sophomore, CTIMS major, journalism minor from Washington, D.C. at Morehouse College.
Okay, so my first question is, what pushed you to continue to be a journalist even against the odds of segregation and discrimination?
Can you hear me in the back? Okay. What really pushed me to remain as the first black woman reporter at the Washington Post in 1961 when I arrived and faced so many challenges because the city of Washington, the nation's capital, was a very segregated place. And so I faced challenges both inside and outside of the newsroom. For example, it was very hard for me to get a taxi cab to go on my assignments. And of course, it was very important that I get my story done on time and make my deadline. So often I would go into some neighborhoods and they didn't believe I was a reporter. I was told to go around to the maid's entrance when I went to cover some assignments in white neighborhoods. Some of my colleagues at the Post were, somewhat civil inside, but if they saw me outside, they would pretend they didn't know me. And all that was very humiliated. But so those are some of the the difficulties that she was referring to. But what pushed me was, first of all, it was the civil rights movement was pushing forward in high gear. And so Martin Luther King and all the leaders who were breaking down barriers, they were saying to us, go into these corporations and make a difference. And So I knew that I needed to be successful in order to make room for other black women journalists. I know that if I had, done the snap my finger thing and walked out, it would have been many years before another black woman would have been hired by the Washington Post. And that's also part of the psychological and spiritual attitude that many in our generation were, that was implanted within us. You may be one, but you represent 1,000. And so part of it was, being able to persevere in the face of the kind of difficulties that we were experiencing.
My question is, what made you fall in love with journalism?
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. I fell in love with journalism because I saw how journalism was going to introduce me to new worlds. It was going to be a profession that was going to take me beyond the life that I knew and just be a way for me to learn about different people, different ideas, different locations, and also share all of that with the public. So that is what has happened all over all these years, because in many ways we sometimes talk about journalism as being an instance where we have a front row seat on history, and we did. But I was working for the black press. I was working for a newspaper in Louisville, Kentucky called the Louisville Defender, and I was a freshman in college. And I had gotten a job as a secretary to the editor. And one day the editor came to me and he said, well, the society editor is ill, so we're going to send you out to cover a story. And I was surprised, but I thought I'll give it my best if he thought I could do it. And so that is how I learned, even in the small black middle class that we had in Louisville, Kentucky, there was enough difference in that life, in my life. And my life was really very good in so many ways, because I am a product of, people who loved me as a child, people who supported me as a child, in my family, in my community, in my school, in my church. So I'm not, but I just didn't know so many things about other people in Louisville, other black people in Louisville. And so I saw that this just was a profession that was just going to open the world and new worlds to me in different ways.
So what motivated you to risk your career at the very beginning and cover the events surrounding the Little Rock Nine?
You're referring to the integration of Central High School.
Yes.
Well, at that point, I was a 20-year-old recent graduate of Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri. And my boss was the person who was covering that big story, the integration of Central High School, when 9 hand-picked African-American students were going to be integrating this white high school. There had been a lot of preparation, and everybody thought things were going to go smoothly, but they did not. And my boss went to Little Rock, and he said, you stay here in the office and you cover the local stories. And I said, fine, that's what I expected to do. But what happened was my boss was beaten by a white mob as he was attempting to cover the story. And when I saw from my office in Memphis the images of him being beaten by this white mob, I think mistook him for the parents of one of the children. I can't tell you the reason, but at any rate, that is when I said, well, I've got to go. I can't stay here in the office. And so I was motivated by it's that same kind of spirit, I think, that journalists have, which is, on the one hand, I was very concerned about him, but I was thinking, well, who's going to cover the story? And that's why I ended up going that night to Little Rock and staying through the danger.
Well, I grew up in Northwest D.C., and in your 50 years as a journalist, what are some of the key ways you believe gentrification has changed D.C.?
Well, that's an important question, about, how gentrification has changed D.C. I talked about, mentioned earlier, D.C. was a very segregated city, but even when in those early days, it had predominantly black population, but that black population grew, especially with some of the changes that took place as a result of the civil rights movement. The Voting Rights Act, for example, led to more blacks around the country being elected to offices, being elected to mayors. We began to see things we hadn't seen before. So it was a time when D.C. actually became Chocolate City. But now D.C. is Latte City. And, and and some of the negative effects has been that a lot of black people have been moved out. A lot of poor people have been moved out. Things have gotten much more expensive, so that people who might have stayed find that with taxes, et cetera, they are unable to stay. I think there's been a fair amount of corruption in how people have been pushed to give up their homes or to sell their homes at prices that are certainly often way below the value. So the new mayor, Mayor Bowser, is trying to do some things to increase that black participation, black persons living in the district, but it is still in many ways a fairly segregated city, and I think gentrification has accelerated in that problem.
So what were some of the most rewarding things about having your own column?
Well, having my own column, which I did begin. At first, I was a reporter for about 5 years, and then I stopped for 6 years or so when my children were young, and it was before the women's movement, so we didn't have flex hours, or there was no way I felt I could take care of 3 young children and work the long hours the daily newspaper jobs demanded. I think when you find yourself in a situation like that, you're trying to say, how do I make the best out of it? Mm-hmm. And I think that's basically. I'm not sure I remember the last part of your.
Oh, I was just saying, what's one of the most rewarding experiences of having your own column?
Right. But when I went back in 1972, that's when I became an editor, and after that I became a columnist. So I wanted to put it into perspective. One of the most rewarding things was really having a voice and being able, as a black female, to have that black female perspective really appearing on a regular basis in the newspaper. And I must say, there were so many times when what my column was not liked by people internally inside the Post, but I persevered, and I think there was only one time when the editor, Ben Bradley, ever came to me and said something about a column that I had written. There were other people who would come, but not him. So at one point, that the Ku Klux Klan was marching in Washington. And the citizens of Washington were so aroused and so angry that when the Ku Klux Klan began marching down the street, the police kind of kept the crowd away. There turned out to be, some violence, in part because people thought they had a right to, confront the Klan. At any rate, I wrote a column, and I talk about it in the book, in which I actually defended the people who protested because it was just such an egregious error, for that to happen. And but the fact that there had been some damage to public property was the issue that had aroused the city practically. And so Bradley called me into his office and kind of politely chewed me out. But most of the time, what made the column writing so very, very important for me was just really trying to get let it be a voice for the voiceless, because this was a time before social media was big and all of that. So it was so great to have just regular people writing about them, writing about families, writing about some of the issues with which black people had long wrestled, issues of how discrimination was written into a lot of the laws of America, that very often things that were negatively affecting large portions of black people were not understood. So it was a great time to also interview multicultural experts on all of these subjects, and to really bring another perspective, at a time when that was not happening very much. Now, it certainly started happening later, but at that point, it was not happening.
Can you describe your experience as NABJ president?
That was a very interesting experience. I grew a lot. It left me on my knees. I had to pray a lot to get through it. Well, the most important thing that happened was that I was president during the time when we had the big unity convention in this city, in Atlanta. I was president from 1993 to 1995. And the unity convention was a convention where 4 groups met together: African Americans, the National Association of Black Journalists, the Asian American Journalists Association, the National Association of Latino or Hispanic Journalists, and Native American journalists. And so that turned out very well, but it was interesting that some of the problems we encountered were conflicts, kind of cultural conflicts. Some of the black people felt like the Latinos were, getting more than they should, and it was just a lot of internal issues that we had to work out before we could really have a unity convention. So working through that, one of the things I did was to find some money from a foundation and brought everybody together for a weekend, and then I brought a very well-known person who could really help work through cultural conflicts to sit down with everybody and talk to and get to the heart of some of the issues. And my view had been it's more important to look at what you have in common when you're in these situations. What do you have in common? You get every group, has a right to be chauvinistic about itself, but you can't do or say things that that really harm the others. And so we just had to work out a lot of cultural things, but because we had certain things in common, all 4 of the groups of color, one thing we all had in common was that none of our communities were being covered deeply enough, regularly enough. You know, we looked for what we had in common in order to push toward a reconciliation of the issues at hand. So I think that that was one of the, being president when we had that big convention here was really very, very crucial, because we made a statement before the world. When you had, 8,000 journalists of color with all different groups represented, that is, you had the whole media industry paying attention to what was going on, and you had people who read about it paying attention. And so this was a good big step in moving forward this whole idea of diversity in the media and the importance of diversity and what that means to the collective. And it's a struggle that still goes on.
So I'm going to use my New York voice because this is not working for me. So what inspired you to write your book now, like right now?
Well, I think it really was inspired by the fact that I finished my journalistic work. I had worked for about 15 years bringing young people into the media. At the Washington Post, we started the Young Journalist Development Program, where we actually went into high schools and began to help high school students write their own stories, start their own newspapers, television, whatever media they were interested in and that they had the facilities for. So that was very gratifying, because I found people who became reporters at papers like the Washington Post, the Memphis Commercial Appeal, many other papers. So, but I think there comes a time in your career when you said, I've kind of done everything that I'm going to do at this point as far as being a journalist. And I wanted to use the book to not only tell my story. So the book is a memoir, yes, but it's also a book about how black journalists and then other journalists of color and then some white journalists who worked with us, who were our allies, how we all came together to start organizations like the Institute for Journalism Education, which really over the years trained young people as reporters, editors, managers, and really just made a difference in journalism all over the world. And we look and we see that we have hundreds, even thousands of people who have been through the Maynard Institute programs. So I wanted to write a book that showed part of that history, and also to let, it's important that even though we have not made the progress that we want to make, the fact remains that, diversity is still a big issue in America. And so I think a book which talks about how to make the media look more like America is one of those books that gives everybody an opportunity to see how many kinds of people are involved in bringing about change. And that was one of the reasons. I think I was at that point in my life, and then I wanted to also show that change was possible. And in a way, I think it might have been, providential that the book came out now, because, it's a time when journalists are being attacked by the highest office in the land. And so, when you have a president who talks about journalists are the enemies of the people and talks about fake news and all of that, I think the fact that my book came out at a time where it talked about the study that one goes through in order to be a journalist. It talked about the ethical issues that are involved. talks about the real, crucial nature of making, how do you get people like you and I develop intellectually, develop spiritually, develop mentally, of course, but to be able to really speak truth to power and to bring about change. And so I think my book hopefully will help in presenting another real picture of what it takes to be a journalist in America and what we can achieve through the field of mass media or some of the related fields that you represent today.
As an advocate for African Americans in media, how have your adversities pushed you to excel in your personal and professional career?
Well, I think my adversities pushed me to excel because once again, I knew that this was about something bigger than me. It was being a journalist and making a difference in media was something that could have a larger impact. And so when I was going through the things that I was going through at the Post, especially in those early days, I never came back to the Post and said, they think I'm not a reporter. They think they called me a maid. I didn't go back and say I couldn't get a cab. I can't do this. I can't do that, because I knew that was going to make it harder for the next person, as I said previously. But still, I think the adversities also gave me somewhat of a mental toughness that you have to be a journalist. And hopefully not a mental toughness that's a negative, but it helped me to endure. And that I'm very grateful for.
So what advice would you give to young black journalists who are basically starting their careers in the industry and stuff like that?
Well, I asked one of my mentees, a young man I started mentoring about 3 years ago, and who is now a reporter at Thomson Reuters in New York. When I got your questions, they sent me a lot of questions, guys. I asked him what advice would he give. So let me read what he said. Did you really?
Yeah.
She said she met him before. She met him at the career fair. Yeah. Okay, so this was just his comment. Then I'll add my own. He said, this is one young journalist. He's now, I think, 28, going on 29. He said, his advice to any young person like you in this audience, he's also a graduate of Morehouse, so as well as Northwestern. He said, always find ways to add value to the story, to the media organization, and to people. His second thing was trust your instincts, but be sure to listen more than you speak. His third bit of advice was don't feel too tied to one job or beat. Be open to covering something unfamiliar or challenging. It could prepare you for your next job and possibly make your career. And I was on Georgia Public Television, Public Radio earlier today, and I also asked your question to the young lady who was interviewing me. And she talked about the importance of self-care. And it's something I think is important too. As journalists, we often cover difficult stories. Mm-hmm. Those stories that make you, when you get home, your heart is hurting and your back is tired. when you cover these stories that need to be covered, the stories about race and stories about, whatever we are assigned to do and whatever your beat is so often. But it's important to realize that you might need to have some help, just emotionally, if you're having, trouble, because there's so many things that, that challenge you as journalists. And I know that when I came along in those early days, and when people would do things that were harmful and hurtful to me, as I've described here, I needed to have somebody with whom I could share those feelings that I couldn't express in the office. Very often because I had worked in the black press for several years before I was hired by the Post, I would go to some of my friends in the black press, those who work for Jet Magazine. I had known them, and I could talk to them, and I could share certain things. But I think it's important to understand that, we're made up of spirit and mind and body and intellect and emotions and all of those things. And it's necessary to keep, reinforcing the positives about yourself, and to believe in a power higher than yourself that can also help you. But it is it's a challenging profession, but it has the potential to really make a difference. And I say that for, people in any form of communications.
What is one thing you would tell your younger self when you were starting out?
Oh, that was one of the questions I didn't get an answer to. I thought about it. Boy, so much. As I write in the book, I write about a lot of my journeys in the book. I write about, the journalistic journey. I write about the weight journey. I used to try to, solve and salve my emotions sometimes by, eating things that I shouldn't have eaten. Sweets and things like that were an issue. And it took me many years before I was able to, find a free fellowship that helped me with those issues. So I think one of the things I would say to my younger self would be realize you can't change the world, but you can, once you figure out what you can change, to also be certain and find ways to take care of yourself while you're doing that. And I think most young people know there are many ways to do it that are not harmful, like overeating or drinking or drugs or any of those things. Those are the things that have the potential to kill you. But to really look to some of the things like I mentioned, such as, for me it was a free, low-cost fellowship that operates all over the world. And, that helped me as well as some of the other things I write about in the book in terms of my faith and those things that gave me strength and continue to feed me now.
Okay, so we wanted to open up the floor for any questions any of the students may have. Just you here. You can just state your name, classification, and what school you go to.
Hello. Can you? Okay. My name is Najee Garnes. I go to Clark Atlanta University. I'm a sophomore, mass media major, concentration in journalism. My question is, although you made history as being the first black female reporter at the Washington Post.
A little more slowly.
I'm sorry. Although you made history as being the first black female reporter at the Washington Post, how important was the black press to your career development?
Mm-hmm. The question of the importance of the black press to my development, it was extraordinarily important. It was one, first of all, I was told how to write in a different way. I was told in very straightforward terms when I didn't do something that was adequate. I remember when I worked at Jet Magazine, I used to have to write a little of everything, including that they used to have a feature about the beauty of the week, and I could never get it right, talking about why whatever. So one of the editors told me, he said, "You write like you've got concrete in your fingers." That's the kind of thing that you can take it, but he's telling you the truth. He's telling you something you got to work on. But in general, the black press was so helpful to me in seeing the courage of the black reporters who covered the civil rights movement and who were writing about what was happening in the South, in behind the cotton curtain, when white reporters were not even thinking about going south to cover that story. And their courage in just taking their lives in their hands, because white sheriffs would kill them if they knew that they were there to interview black people who had been, victims, people who had witnessed lynchings. There were about 5,000 lynchings in the years after the emancipation. And these guys were going down in the South. They would have to pretend that they were preachers, and they'd put a Bible under their arms when they walked down the street, or they had their old-fashioned typewriters, which most of you have probably never seen, but they would wrap them in, kind of old clothes and kind of amble down the streets like they were just, another black man carrying some clothes. And they'd be journalists, reporters, going back and writing these stories, and then getting them in those newspapers. And so that kind of courage really, really helped me. So when I was assigned to go to Mississippi and be one of the team of reporters covering integration of Ole Miss, I was there to look at the black community, and I was very happy to do that, to have that assignment. But when I did that, their courage and what I saw of what they did was something that strengthened me as well. So I think, the black press has been an important part, and there were so many women in the black press that I admired. People like, obviously, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was the great anti-lynching heroine. Obviously, she was at the beginning, long before most of us were born, but she was representative of the spirit of black journalists, in really making a difference, and so she was one of my heroines.
Any other students have a question? Okay, I'll take you, and then that will be it. Go ahead, stand up.
Hi, I'm Chastity Virgil. I'm a sophomore at Clark Atlanta University. I'm a mass media arts major, and I just wanted to know, with media becoming more and more digital, can you explain the importance of print journalism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think print journalism still has a very important role, especially, I think, in the long-form journalism. What is different about print journalists is that I guess the best way to put it is that the staffs of major newspapers have people who are experts in so many different fields, so that if a story breaks, there are people on that staff who can come forward with the perspective and the knowledge and the background to know how to put that story into context. let's just say something, if something happened that was impossible at this point, but that Donald Trump's taxes were made available, you know, and they were made available, and they were not expected to be made available, but you know, we had 1 day's notice, and suddenly somebody is faced with this. Very often, and I'm not going to try to denigrate digital media because that's important too, but how many people on that staff would have the background to take all of that information and come out the next day with a story that really summarized what happened? What do these taxes show? What do they tell us? And that's one of the real positives of the kind of long-form journalism that's still being done in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. I think of something very exciting that's happening, and this is the reporting and the work of a black woman journalist named Nicole Hannah-Jones, who works for the New York Times. And she has been doing this project called the 1619 Project. And when she talks about the 400 years that black people have been in America. And that project, you know, was so successful that she is being taught. It's been talked about all over the world. It was developed in, you know, print journalism, and she is, you know, she's brought information to. It's important that it's being brought to white audiences that did not know, for example, the impact that blacks had had on the U.S., let's say the U.S. economy. And so she had, you know, articles in this 1619 Project that show how slavery helped build Wall Street. These are the kind of stories that you don't just pop out. You know, it's not opinion. It's based on fact and on lots of digging. And I was so excited to hear about the Georgia News Lab and some of the investigative training that you're receiving here, because that is very crucial. So I guess my answer to that would be you need both. It's not either or. It's the digital, but you also need the print. And that adds so much value to one's knowledge. And I think the reason I think the 1619 Project that the New York Times did, that Nicole Hannah-Jones spearheaded, I hope it can be a game changer, and that it will inspire other black journalists, you know, to take on big projects who work for newspapers. And I hope it will also inspire white editors to understand the importance of doing some of these stories. I think too often in the past, and maybe even presently, white editors have not been willing to listen to black voices on their staff when they are saying, these are important stories. This is something I would like to work on. And that, you know, that's all part of what I think needs to happen in America as we are in this very, very divided time. It's time, I think, white people really need to know more about black contributions, and I think, a lot of what is happening now, it's also informing blacks. So I think we're at it's a time that's very divided, but it's also an opportunity for me to really make a difference. And I'm just thrilled that so many of you in this audience are interested in becoming journalists on some platform.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Lewis. I am a mass media arts major with a concentration in radio, TV, film here at Clark Atlanta University from Chicago, Illinois. I want to know, during your span as a journalist, you've written a countless amount of stories, but is there one in particular that you've written that you found as your most favorite or most memorable piece?
Wow, there were so many. I write in the book about the civil rights coverage way back in the 60s. And I talk about, the Mississippi adventure. That's one of my most memorable assignments. But in terms of, there were so many articles. I'm thinking of one that actually led to a book. And that was when I was an editor in the style section. And my job as an editor was to support the writers and do that, but every now and then I would steal a story from them and go and cover it and write about it myself. And I went to write about a big event that was happening in New York that celebrated Paul Robeson, the great black singer, actor. I call him a Renaissance man. And that particular when I wrote that story, it actually led to eventually to me writing a book about Paul Robeson, and that book was published in 1976. So I think that was one of my favorite stories as well. But I think during the there were just so many opportunities and so many things that I did write about, and I loved getting black experts to help to put things into perspective, because there were many articles that I used to write in the column, particularly about black families, because black families had been so stigmatized in the white press and or in the larger white society, and when articles were written, even government officials, black families were misrepresented. And so, being able to come back with excellent thinkers, to interview them at places, at universities across the country and write about all of that. All those were just very rewarding, and I hoped that they did help the larger cause.
Dorothy, I want to thank you for coming. I'm Ron Thomas, the director of the Morehouse Journalism Program. I've known Dorothy from NABJ conventions for a long, long time. I had one question, which is in my news writing classes here, and we spent about a week talking about journalistic ethics, and we focused on the case of a young black Washington Post reporter about 30 years ago, Janet Cook, who made up a story, presented it as if it was fact, ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize, and then the Post had to give the Pulitzer Prize back, and she got fired. And so what I wondered is, one, did you know Janet Cook personally? And
Yes.
what was your reaction emotionally to what happened? Were you surprised or not surprised, and based on what you knew of her?
Right. Well, I write about this in the book as well. Hope you all would buy the book. The Janet Cook incident was really painful. I always felt like, since I had been there longer than most black people with that early experience, that when young people came in, I would always go and speak to them and say hello, and I did the same with her. And but when that story, Jimmy's World, was published, there was so many people on the Post staff, black people, who said, we don't believe it. Cortland Malloy, who is a very well-known columnist, I'm sure since you lived in D.C., you might have heard of Cortland Malloy. It was a story that Mayor Barry, he immediately said, "Oh yes, we've already found Jimmy, and he's in treatment." It was just crazy, because there were people who denied that the story existed. Then, when people who said yes, it's true, like Barry, they had to back off and say, "No, I don't know anything about it." And so when it was finally revealed that she had made the story up, it was very painful. And I think for me, the main thing was, since I had been working in my mind so hard for so many years to try to increase diversity, I thought it was going to hurt future potential black employees, because editors were going to say, are you another Janet Cook? Can we trust you? Can you, like, I thought it was going to hurt our forward progress as journalists. And I wrote a column in which I finally said, something I don't usually say in my columns, that somebody happened to be black, but I just said that Janet Cook was she was a brilliant liar, and she just happened to be black. I mean, I just didn't want to, I knew that editors were going to, use that as a yardstick to measure other black journalists. And I met journalists, even since I've been doing the book tour, who have said that when they walked into newsroom and applied for jobs, they were basically asked, are you like Janet Cook or you're not? And I believe everybody, has a right to redemption. And I certainly hope at some point things happen well for Janet Cook, but not as a journalist.
All right, thank you.
I am the advisor to the school paper, and I teach a class in news editing. This class is composed of upper-level journalism students, all of whom are concentrating in print journalism. Mm-hmm. Some of them do not work with the school newspaper. Could you speak to that?
Well, it sounds like a very lost opportunity by not working on the school newspaper, because first of all, it's a lot. It's certainly an extra task. It's not easy being an editor of the newspaper, but it is so crucial, because it does give it gives one the experience of really working on deadline, the reporting, the editing. It gives you just the experience of working with the staff as you decide what is news, what is not news. It helps to prepare you for your job once you leave any of the colleges and universities here. So I'm sad to hear that. I know I was the editor of my college newspaper, and it really made a difference. Maybe that'll change.